And next up, we have Professor David Stovall from UIC here to talk about, I don't have the, somebody have the program? I can't remember the name of this.
Race, housing, and structural.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Race, housing, and structure removal, understanding foreclosure in Chicago.
Y'all, I'm gonna take a note from Brother Diaz. Can everybody hear me all right? All right. Reverend, I appreciate y'all having me tonight. I'm actually gonna sit down. Right? This now, when we talk about racism, racism, structural removal, and foreclosure crisis, I don't want to repeat what Christian has said, but I want to put some nuance on that in relationship to the city writ large. And it's something in Chicago that we often forget, but we live every day. We live in one of the most segregated cities in the world, right? And it's important to understand that. And in the United States, it's always interesting. Chicago is always in the top 3, with Boston and a very strange city I always think about in terms of segregation, right? It's always Chicago, Boston, and Milwaukee. Now, our cousins to the north, I very rarely figure out why they're in that index, but it's the way in which they configure segregation, the ways in which where people live, how long they've lived there, and then what have been their mobility rates. So Milwaukee has one of the lowest mobility rates in the country, meaning that people, when they live in a particular area, they very rarely move. Now, ironically, in Milwaukee, they're also experiencing extremely uneven development, i.e. gentrification. And if you think about gentrification, you just think about it in a very simple way. One group moving in, another group moving out. The in group, usually, this isn't always the case because there can be some nuance in it. The in group is usually a different race and more wealthy. The out group is usually a group of folk of color and historically not having as much access to resources. And I say that instead of poorer because I think it's important to delineate between the two, right? Because what we're talking about is access to resources and how communities have been disinvested in a place like Chicago. So when you look at neighborhoods in Chicago, it's critically important to understand what has been taken away from those spaces. So Chris talked about a school that is struggling to get bathrooms together, and then Revolution Brewery getting $200,000 to do a bathroom, right? Which would probably cost a quarter of that cost to get toilet paper and stalls for the young folks in the school. So this notion of what is a priority and how those priorities are enacted by way of systems, not just random acts of one-time greed, but that's included too. Right? So we don't want to be dismissive of that. And when we look at the financial structures that actually operate in this space, you have to ask a different set of questions. I was talking to a group of folks a couple of nights ago about TIPS, and that's tax incremental financing. Easy way to explain TIPS. I know Ben Jarafsky has done a workshop here before, but just think about tax rate being frozen. Any money that's made over the tax rate, you can actually use to support whatever issues you identify. Now, Chicago does something pretty backwards in this. So your largest TIP, now remember, TIP was supposed to address blight in communities. Your largest TIP district in Chicago is LaSalle Street. So the financial district gets the most TIP money when this thing was actually designed to address blight. Now, last time I checked, between Jackson and Madison or LaSalle, they're not experiencing too much blight, right? But again, these resources are garnered to address these particular spaces. Now, when you think about Logan Square, Hermosa, Avondale, Humboldt Park, there are a couple of things that come into mind. And I'd like to think about how we think about foreclosures, gentrification, and structure removal practically. And now, as a lifelong Chicagoan, when I started driving in Chicago, I realized that Chicago is not a city of neighborhoods. Chicago is a city of universes, right? These are different places, right? Like I would go up north and not even realize I was still in Chicago. right? Or I would go out west or go to folks' houses in what I thought was the suburbs, and I'm thinking I'm in Iowa, right? So this thing around how living in very contained spaces actually affects how you move in the world. So I always think about understanding this particular place through a restaurant that many of you all are familiar with, El Cid, right? Now, one of my favorite dishes is camarones al diablo, right? Now, I used to come from the south side of the city to El Cid to get it down, right? Man, camarones al diablo is the joint, right? Back this is when El Cid had 2 locations, right? One local. So I come with a group of friends, and I look on the menu, and camarones al diablo is no longer there. And I look and I said, what's that? And you're always thinking, is it new ownership, right? Or has it switched? And then I thought to myself, what's actually happening, and I'm being right outside the Blue Line station, right by the Zocalo, you think to yourself, like, what's happening here? And then I asked the server, I said, let me guess. People were complaining that the dish was too spicy. She laughed, right? She said, how did you know? Right? I said, well, wow. So we talk about gentrification and its affects, but it gets so deep that menus become gentrified. Right? So you think about this, right? And that's racialized. I said, look, the white folk came in here and said it's too spicy, and now it's off the menu. That's quite a bit of power. Right? To actually control what people are actually eating. Right? And then, but as always, in our neighborhood, Chicago, Universe South, she said, look, the folk at Backs know how to make it. You want me to take care of that? No problem. Right? But again, as the years move on, and the staff might change, and your serving staff might change, these things get erased from memory. And I think it really becomes important, so when we talk about this uneven development, I'm also thinking about erasure, containment, and expansion. Because one of the rationales of gentrification is that the group that is deemed to be undesirable is actually contained and constrained. It's shrunk in many ways. And that group of the desirable folks are allowed to expand in the space. Now, something I just saw out here in front, and this is kind of a new act in Chicago, maybe over the last 15 years, permit parking. Right? So this changes how we actually engage with particular communities, and under particular now Department of Revenue structures, who's allowed to come or who will be contained or pushed away from those spaces. Right? So now you're with the permit parking, and here in Chicago, you get booted after how many tickets? 2. Now, I will reveal that many of us in the city of Chicago have figured out a way to alleviate that. Sometimes folks need the boot key, and can take care of things for a small nominal fee. But at the same time, this becomes important in terms of how neighborhoods are actually made to siphon themselves and keep others out. So now it becomes hard for you to come to a space because you can't park. It becomes even harder to go to a place if there is a continued police presence that has often identified who the undesirables are. And the terms and conditions from who travels in those particular spaces. I'll give you all another example. We've all seen the safe passage zones, right? Now with little ones, there's not as much a problem when they may venture outside the safe zone pathways. But as you get older, so you think about high schoolers in Kelvin Park, you think of high schoolers at Clemente, you now see if they are away from these safe passage zones, there's a push by law enforcement to get them back into those spaces. or to say that they're out of compliance because they're supposed to be using the safe passage pathways. Now, are those safe passage pathways posted in their school? Often no. Are the pathways even posted in the neighborhood? You just got a triangle and you're supposed to follow the triangles. Good luck with that. Right? But this particular set of relationships now become important because there's another thing that fuels this uneven development / gentrification. You all's proximity to 9094. You all are right in between the Central Business District and O'Hare. And that becomes important for two things. Because when we look at the sale of homes, and this is something that often is said under our breath, but this is what we know. The number one determinant for a family buying a home in a neighborhood is what? School. Right? So now the idea of improving schools or repurposing some schools or having you in proximity to a selective enrollment school, it never really says you're going to get in, but it's nice that you actually are in proximity to it. Right? Because we've heard of new data around selective enrollment schools in Chicago. Right? Statistically, it's easier to get into Harvard. Right? This just came out a couple of months ago. Right? So this thing around looking at these processes become important. And I think an example historically now fuels what we're seeing happening here in this particular community, Logan Square, and the neighboring spaces. And it actually comes from the west side of the city. So on the west side of the city, I encourage folks to read an article by a person named Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's called A Case for Reparations. It's in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. Some of you all have seen it. But Ta-Nehisi Coates identifies something very particular that I think actually has some resonance here in Logan Square. You have lifelong or long-term residents in this neighborhood who are now being pushed out in a number of different ways. Now, I understand the evictions last year was a struggle that was centered in rentals, but there's another space to that I think becomes important. Because now, this ground central for developers looking for new properties. In fact, here on Kimball, so it's always funny, you see stuff happening in neighborhoods, and I see this kind of grandiose house that has all this wood paneling on the front, right? And I mean, it's palatial, right? You know, in Chicago, depending on where you're from and how you've grown up, like 4 families living in there? No, that's one family, right? They got 3 rooms randomly to themselves, right? So this thing around looking at that space and now saying, how does that change the relationship to the remaining housing structures or the physical plant, as some architects talk about in communities? So I'm looking at that and saying, all right, that's not one-off. Because if I go deeper, you'll see them, the little spots, and they just kind of pop up, right? And my students, in addition to being at a college, I work with high schoolers. So my students always say, Doc, the sign of gentrification is not the Starbucks. It's not the new cafe. It's not the boutique on whatever random street. I said, okay, y'all, what's our signal then? And they said, the white job. And I saw somebody driving up stretching, right? One of those little stretches. I'm saying, here it is. One more time, right? And they could pinpoint it, right? Say, look, we can come out and see them, right? So they go out, they take me out to the spot. Okay, here comes about 3:15. Okay, this is the afternoon, and this is how you frame it. This is an afternoon run, right? And then folks start coming through, and I'm like, It's like, oh wait, Diane, it gets better. You know, you gotta have one with the baby stroller. You gotta have the baby stroller, right? Here they come, right? And then my sister say, well, you gotta, Doc, it gets even better. You got the baby stroller and the dog. Right? And it's like, and one of my students was explaining, he's like, yeah, man, I sit on my porch and I just wait, right? And he says it's not a welcoming way, but it's a way to say, I do not know what's going to happen next. Right? So this thing around looking at these processes as structural, right? The idea, remember, Chicago has lost 200,000 residents since 2000. 178,000 were black. Of that 178,000, 45% were school-aged young people. So now when we look at this particular set of developments and we see these things happening, we have to ask not only a different set of questions, but we also need to pay attention to the rationales that govern this process, right? So particular communities are not just looked upon as sites for development, but communities are intentionally targeted. And they're targeted by way of their location to schools and transportation. And we see that throughout the city, right? So I live in Woodlawn, right? So the University of Chicago is encroaching south. They own all this property on 63rd from Stony Island to Cottage Grove. Now, they build that piece up, they sell that to university faculty and university employees, and now they have a continued police presence that actually contains West Woodlawn, which is west of Cottage Grove. Right? As practice, in fact, the 3rd Police District calls it violence suppression. Right? But again, kind of dubious who's being suppressed in that condition. But at the same time, if we bring it back here, now you see not only the developments on Milwaukee and Logan, but also the housing that's proximal to those particular main thoroughfares. Right? So now you see that particular development. You have seen your property taxes triple and quadruple in particular spaces here. We've seen this all throughout Chicago. And then now, when we talk about a foreclosure crisis, remember, communities, and I want to keep us on this thing around communities being targeted. So the rationale for many spaces, and many senior citizens were offered these adjustable rate mortgages. With the idea or reverse mortgage, with the idea of getting an upfront payment. What was never mentioned was that those mortgages, through the financial instruments, would often split into 2 and 3 mortgages that you all had to pay, or they would actually balloon in costs that made them impossible to keep the homes. So we often think about 2008. In the United States, we are always driven, and this is too much Fox News, by panic mode decisions. Right? So what if I said, you think about the Great Recession of 2008, what if we actually said there have actually been 7 recessions since 1939? Right? We very rarely think about that, because remember, what's the definition of a recession? 2 quarters of negative growth. So now, everybody's saying that this thing is happening, and we talk about credit default swaps and derivatives, but at the same time, when they come in the form of these adjustable rate mortgages or reverse mortgages, now what happens is that people can no longer afford those particular payment structures, and now those homes not only get foreclosed, but now sold at a least expensive rate, built up, and now are valued to the point where property taxes now are associated with that new development, making it even harder for the people who are able to remain to stay in the community. So there's the actual advent of the foreclosure, and then there's the residual of the financial structure that actually keeps the taxes up. And this is where families get hit the hardest. So when we see this particular development, and we see it here, Logan Square and Hope Park are notorious for this, right? You actually have people drive around these neighborhoods, you all probably seen them, knocking on people's doors, offering upfront cash for the house. Right? I mean, I've had a good friend of mine I talked to today. Her father gets a request probably every other month. Right? He has a corner house right up the street, and they offer him cash on hand. Now, He's intelligent and resourceful. The first thing he says is, I'm from Chicago. Somebody has just walked up to my house and offered me a cash payment. Again, I am from Chicago. If you are offering me that money, I know it's worth anywhere from 6 to 15 times more. Please, thank you. I'll talk to you later. Right? But this type of thing, but many families, and again, understanding the economic situation of some families, those upfront payments now become practical. And when the family takes that payout, now whoever gets that property now gets a very valuable property that they can decide whatever, either to remain or to sell it to someone else to build whatever in whatever locale. And there's an international component to this. So Chicago is purporting itself as a global city, right? Millennium Park and ice skating, and then whether or not George Lucas is going to be able to build a random mountain-looking funny tower, right? Whatever that is, right? But at the same time, when these things happen, that residual effect often affects the spaces that now grant you access to those spaces. And this community is one. By main thoroughfare, by rail, and now, and this is another sign of this uneven development, and I know I saw a couple folks bring them in tonight, bike paths. Right? So because bike paths are markers, right? And this is an interesting way. And now, healthy living is one thing, but there's also a political economy of that in terms of actually making bikes accessible in certain spaces. And even, you all have this around here, now you got the green light with the bike in it. You've seen those now? And now this place now becomes markers for, now realtors refer to it as a walkability index. Right? So now, if you think about these particular things and how they are encroaching on communities, now the questions like you all are asking at Somos Logan Square now become part of the larger rhetoric to understand how this is affecting communities, right? Because Chicago has now become ground zero for the rest of the country, especially in that relationship between housing and education. Right? We've seen this in LA, we're seeing this in New York City, we're seeing this in Houston, we're seeing this in Cleveland, we're seeing this in Milwaukee. So now, these particular sets of relationships become critically important. Now, we talk about these things as structural, but what structures are the creation of humans. That means exactly because they are the creations of humans, they can be interrupted and reimagined.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the work that I see you all as doing. So if we're talking about reimagining a livable, affordable, sustainable city, then we have to ask people questions around what that looks like racially, economically, in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of ability, and start to center those questions in our analysis. And if we're thinking about rethinking these spaces, then we have to be clear around what is happening, so we're not fooled or duped by anybody that's come up with something shiny offering it to us. Because this is what we see a lot of times in charter schools, right? It's a play on families' desperation. You've had 40 years of madness. Here's this new thing. We don't know what this new thing is, but at least it's new. Now, give us your son and daughter so we can suspend them and kick them out. Right? This is what the whole Noble Street Charter endeavor is. Right? We have to name the names. If you're collecting $5 for demerits and then collect $500,000 at the end of the school year and none of that money goes back to resources in the school, we got problems. Right? And it has to be named. And I think the work that you all are doing in this space is naming that reality while putting a face to it and actually working to change that condition. So if we are committed to changing that human condition, the things that I've talked about, but actually to move us forward with an understanding that we're up against a behemoth but that behemoth can be interrupted, can be defeated, and can be reimagined.